Welcome back. I'm Austin Westfall, a live look at Jerusalem. The first phase of the Gaza ceasefire was 6 weeks long, and everything that was supposed to happen during it did happen. Israeli hostages were returned in exchange for Palestinian prisoners, but those 6 weeks end today, and now we're watching for what comes next. Dr. Alon Burstein is here. Alon, we'll get to the ceasefire in a second, but I got to ask you about the Trump-Zelensky meeting first. Is the Middle East taking notes about what happened in the Oval Office yesterday?
Good to see you, Austin. I think absolutely. One of the things that you and I talked about several months ago when, Trump was just about to take office and we were talking, how is the Middle East possibly preparing for this? And one of the things that I said then is that, Trump is fairly unique in as much as he is very unpredictable and extremely emotional. And what ends up happening is if he gets along with a leader of a country, he can end up, meeting with a leader of North Korea, the United States' greatest enemy or one of the greatest enemies, because he feels like maybe that's the direction to go. As opposed to if he doesn't get along with a leader of a country, it sort of doesn't matter what treaties the countries may have had in the past. That doesn't matter. Now it's a new ballgame. And in the Middle East, everyone was taking note of that. We saw that play out exactly in the Trump-Zelensky meeting. One of the things that you and I talked about when we discussed how the Trump-Netanyahu meeting went, you were saying that, we're looking at what Trump is saying. And I said, yeah, but notice that mostly what we're seeing is Netanyahu is smiling. No matter what he thinks of this, we don't know at all. All he will say is, I approve. I think Trump's plan is wonderful. We don't know what Netanyahu actually wants, but he knows that in order to stay on good terms with the United States under the Trump administration, you need to stay on good terms with the president himself. It's not just about the two countries being friends, being on the same ideological side. It's about actually being on good personal terms. And I think the president of Ukraine failed to see that. He saw that there were joint relations or joint ideas between Ukraine and the United States in the past, as far as stopping Russian influence and Russian military advance and things like that. And I think he probably assumed to some extent that this is going to continue during this time. And we saw what happens when that plays out, when actually the personal relationship is enough to almost lead to an explosion between the countries diplomatically.
So let's talk about the ceasefire, because this is something that we got to kind of work out here. Barak Ravid of Axios saying the Israeli Prime Minister's office says Israel agreed to a U.S. proposal for extending the Gaza ceasefire in return for release of hostages, but claims Hamas refuses. So is the first phase officially over, Alon? Has there been any progress to extend this thing at all? Where does it stand right now?
So I'll start from making some sense out of what has happened until now, and then where we are, and this latest announcement that came out of Israel's Prime Minister's office in the last hour. The first phase of the ceasefire and hostage deal is officially over. It was 42 days. It ended tonight at midnight in the Middle East, which was about 2 hours ago. During that phase, as you said, mostly everything that was supposed to happen happened. We had a truce that was largely maintained. It was violated a little bit by both sides here and there, but largely maintained. The IDF redeployed the way it was supposed to redeploy, and Palestinians can now move north in the Gaza Strip. We had the release of 30 hostages, 25 Israelis and 5 foreign nationals, as well as the return of 8 bodies of hostages in exchange for the release of 1,904 Palestinian prisoners, and the entrance of 21,000 aid trucks that entered the Gaza Strip over the last 6 weeks. All of that happened, and that is officially over. What was supposed to happen is that on day 16 of the first phase, i.e. 4 weeks ago, there was supposed to be the beginning of negotiations on the second phase, which is supposed to include a complete ceasefire, both sides declaring an end to the war, IDF withdrawal from the Gaza Strip, in exchange for the release of all hostages and the release of an undetermined amount of Palestinian prisoners. That phase is also supposed to be 42 days. So that was supposed to be negotiated throughout the first phase. It was not negotiated. Israel did not send a delegation to the negotiations. It said that Hamas had violated the deal and therefore it wasn't sending negotiators. Regardless of the reason, the negotiations over that phase didn't start until a few days ago. So that hasn't been worked out. In practice, however, the architects of the deal foresaw that we are very likely to end up in a situation where phase 2 is not worked out, but what happens with phase 1? And they added a clause. They added a clause that says, so long as negotiations over phase 2 are continuing, all of the terms of phase one will still apply, which means that theoretically, if both sides would agree that they are still negotiating phase two, they're not implementing it yet, the truce stays in effect, the entrance of humanitarian aid stays in effect, no release of hostages or Palestinian prisoners, but nonetheless, everything stays in effect. So that's where we are de facto right now. Like right now, 2 hours after the first phase ended, right now we're in that limbo state where negotiations are continuing, so everything is kind of frozen.
So that means there's no fighting for the time being.
No fighting for the time being, right? In theory, there could be a return to fighting because phase one is over, but as long as negotiations are continuing, there is no fighting. However, go ahead.
How many hostages are still in Gaza?
There are still 59 hostages who remain in the Gaza Strip, of which 35 have already been declared dead by the IDF. And I will say that while in the past we really didn't know how many hostages were alive and how many not, with all the hostages that have been released, the 25 Israelis that were released over the first phase, a lot of them came back and they gave live witness accounts to who is alive and who is not. So we have almost firsthand accounts from the last several months that there are 24 hostages that remain alive in the Gaza Strip. Now, it's very important to note, Hamas, and this is something that the organization has done throughout its entire history, Hamas views any male Israeli who is eligible for the military draft, i.e. eligible to be called up for reserve duty up to the age of, they've changed it, 45 or 50, as a potential soldier. That's very important because as far as Hamas is concerned, the formula for how many Palestinian prisoners will be released in exchange for each hostage is now very different. When it came to the civilians that Hamas had kidnapped, it's almost thick to talk about in terms of like how much is a hostage worth, but that is how Hamas looked at it. Females were worth less in terms of the negotiations of how many Palestinian prisoners will be released. The female IDF soldiers were worth more. The top of the rank, so to speak, as far as Hamas is concerned, is male IDF soldiers, which as far as they're concerned, everyone who's now held hostage is considered a potential soldier or an actual soldier. That's very important. In the past, in the exchange for the release of Gilad Shalit, who was a soldier who was kidnapped and held in the Gaza Strip for 5 years, Israel released over 1,000 Palestinian prisoners for just one hostage. Up until now, the formula has been give or take between 50 to 100 Palestinian prisoners for each of the hostages, but Hamas has said, now it's a different ballgame as far as we're concerned. Now it's time for us to start negotiating these hostages as though they are Israeli soldiers, and therefore the price, so to speak, for each hostage is going to be much higher. And this is going to be something that's going to enter into a very hard negotiation with Israel, and we'll see where it develops. Again, right now we're in this limbo phase where everyone's sort of like waiting for the negotiations to continue. The ceasefire is continuing, but no one's really saying that either. Everyone's just sort of like tacitly accepting that the phase one is over, and I guess we're kind of negotiating, so the truce is being maintained, at least for the last 2 hours. But negotiations also aren't happening in the last 2 hours, so it's very unclear right now which way the winds are going to blow. I do want to say something about Barak Ravid's tweet and what was said from Israel. The Prime Minister's office is in a very big political bind right now because it now is being heavily pressured by his coalition, Bezalel Smotrich, and outside his coalition, Itamar Ben-Gvir, to say phase one is over, no more hostages are being released. Trump has said you have to release all hostages or Israel can go back to war. So what are you waiting for? And thus, after 4 hours of negotiations that happened within the Israeli cabinet, Israel came out with this announcement saying that Israel is adopting the framework that Steve Witkoff, the special envoy of the U.S. to Israel, to the Middle East, has proposed for a ceasefire during Ramadan and Passover that will include the release of half of the remaining hostages during day one and half in the last day, but Hamas has rejected it. I do have to say, as someone who follows the Middle East very closely, this is the first time that I've heard of such a proposal. I'm not sure that such a proposal was ever officially made. I don't know of Hamas rejecting it. The only framework that I've heard that Israel has said there is this proposal, we accept it and Hamas rejects it, is in this announcement that was made. So very possibly this was made behind the scenes, but certainly it has not been negotiated enough. I read this more as Israel trying to buy a few more days to say, let's let negotiations happen. Linking a little bit to what we said at the beginning about Zelensky, saying we accept whatever the U.S. administration says. So if they're willing to make this deal, we'll accept it. But for now, again, everyone's just buying time to see where the winds are going to blow in the next day or two, I'm guessing.
So, and more from Barak Ravid. According to the U.S. proposal, the ceasefire in Gaza will be extended for an additional period of 42 days. On the first day of the extended ceasefire, half of the live hostages, half of the dead hostages that are still held by Hamas will be released. Now, are we just getting this in, Ryan? So, yeah, so this is just coming in within the past hour. So are we to glean anything from this alone?
What Israel is suggesting is the latest proposal of the United States. How this has to be read is Israel desperately wants to extend phase one of the deal, right? In phase one, we had the release of hostages in exchange for Palestinian prisoners, but no declared end to the war. In theory, in phase one, at the end of phase one, which we are in now, violence could have resumed. Phase two has an official declaring to the end of the war. That is why Israel has been pushing for some sort of framework like this to say, let's have a 42-day period, which is the same as phase two is supposed to be, continued release of hostages in exchange for Palestinian prisoners as phase two is supposed to be, but explicitly leaving out, and we're going to declare an end to the war. This may relate to something that was published yesterday in the Washington Free Beacon that said that Israel is planning a full return to the war within 4 to 6 weeks, which is 42 days. Again, that's all rumored. It's all speculation. It's all been denied. But it's not coincidence that there are rumors circulating from Israeli generals or former generals that Israel may want to return to the war in 4 to 6 weeks. And now all of a sudden Israel is saying, we'd like to accept a proposal that's a 42-day extension, but it does not include an end to the war. It all has to be taken within that context. But once again, I do think it's important to note Egypt, Qatar, Hamas, none of them said anything about this proposal. And I would say it is because it hasn't actually been proposed. This is something that maybe was discussed between Israel and the United States, but this is more for internal Israeli politics that the Prime Minister's office put out this, we're accepting this, but Hamas is rejecting it. What that is we're buying a few more days. We accepted this, now let's see what Hamas says. Hamas hasn't actually rejected this because it wasn't proposed. This is just one of the frameworks that Israel is trying to propose. Hamas has repeatedly said no. And, from Hamas's perspective, it's not surprising. The only cards that they hold are really the hostages. Hamas does not have, it has the ability to withstand Israeli attacks. We've seen Israel launch everything it has at Gaza for the last 15 months of violence, and Hamas survived. But Hamas doesn't want another 15 months and just surviving. It wants to start rebuilding Gaza and rebuilding its governing capability. They are unlikely to agree to releasing at least all hostages for sure, but even some hostages without some guarantee is going to lead to an end to the war. So Israel is hoping by publishing this idea that the United States is proposing this, and maybe the United States will actually get behind it, and that is the framework that Israel wants, the extension of phase one without ending the war. Hamas said that they're not going to allow the extension of phase one, but we're mostly going to be smarter in a day or two once the sides start to say, okay, so what actually is happening and where the wind's blowing. And it's also important to put this in context. Ramadan, the holiest month in Islam, starts tonight in the Middle East. I mean, around the world, but specifically what we're focusing on is in the Middle East. And that's very important. It's important both because it's a time of religious fervor. It is a time that there's been more spirals of violence in the past on the one hand. On the other hand, Hamas also sees to some extent an obligation to its population. It wants to see people celebrate Ramadan. It wants to see people not having bombs land down on them, but actually having people being able to celebrate, so to speak, this holiday. It's very important to Hamas to see that happen and to be the ones that deliver the ceasefire, see that happen. So all this coming together, and we're going to see where the winds blow. We'll be smarter, in the next few hours, certainly the next few days.
The last time you and I talked earlier this week, we were speaking about this artificial intelligence video that the president put out. Trump released this, I believe it was Wednesday. He's showing his vision of what a future Gaza will look like. My question for you at this point, is there any clarity on who's taking the lead on talks to rebuild Gaza? Egypt and the U.S. are two countries that we discussed last time. Has there been any progress, or is that way too far down the line at this point?
It's happening on a back burner. It's too far down the line to have any concrete plans. Egypt and various different Arab countries came together during the summit of the Arab League that happened in the last several days, and they've all adopted some version. And the Palestinian Authority also, and that's very important, is going to be part of it, to come up with a vision they're going to propose to the United States about how to rebuild Gaza without expelling the Palestinians from the Gaza Strip and having these things like hula girls dancing in the streets and golden statues of the U.S. president. They're going to propose their own vision. But it's very important to note, while the United States can propose its visions, Egypt can propose its visions, Palestinian Authority can propose its visions, it all hinges on two things and two parties that have not actually proposed their vision: Hamas and Israel. Those are the two parties that, by hook or by crook, end up governing the Gaza Strip. If Israel now withdraws from the Gaza Strip, the only government that exists is Hamas. Hamas is not agreeing to the Palestinian Authority coming in, and certainly not agreeing to Trump's vision of hula girls and Elon Musk throwing money at kids. At the same time, Israel, if it ends up occupying the Gaza Strip and somehow setting up its own government, maybe it would agree to some vision of the United States, even though most of the elements within Israel's government have talked about building Israeli settlements there, again, not the Riviera of the Middle East. Maybe it would agree to some vision. It also, though, is not agreeing to Palestinian Authority, Egypt. So a lot of people are proposing ideas, but none of them are actually saying, okay, but how do we get there and actually talk to the parties that would be governing the Strip, Israel or Hamas? One of them, at least, has to agree to this vision, because to say we agree, Egypt, Jordan, the United States agree to a vision, okay, but the implementers on the ground who have to actually facilitate it and enable it and make sure that whoever's implementing it is not shot at are Israel and Hamas. They're the ones who have yet to propose their own vision for what happens. So that's really what we have to end up waiting for while the sides negotiate.
A lot to watch for. And we'll be watching to see what President Trump says at his address to a joint session of Congress on Tuesday as well. Alon uploads his own Middle East updates on his personal YouTube channel as well. As always, Alon, good to see you. Have a good night.
Thank you. Have a good night.